Hello friends! This video is on how to loom knit a seed stitch blanket. It's a small blanket that I made on a Zippy Loom, but you can use this pattern on other looms if you use different yarn. And you can also use this seed stitch pattern to help you make things like scarves. It's an easy stitch that's reversible, so your project will look lovely on both sides. Now before we get started, I'll ask you to subscribe to my channel if you haven't done that yet. That really helps me out. So today we'll be covering number 1, how to mark your loom. Number 2, how to cast on using the chain cast on. Number 3, how to do the seed stitch. Number 4, how to add new yarn. And number 5, how to bind off. To make a 32 by 37 inch blanket, you will need a 44 peg loom. I used 10 of the 4 peg Zippy Looms as well as 4 corners. You'll need 6 balls of Red Heart Grande number 7 yarn. You'll need a hook, a pair of scissors, and you'll likely need stitch markers to mark your pegs, and an optional crochet hook to help you weave in your ends. Let's start the project by setting up and marking our loom. I've set up my 44 pegs into a rectangle so I can save space on my table rather than using a single straight row of pegs. I've marked peg 1 with green elastic, and I've marked peg 44 with red elastic. Pegs 3, 5, 7, 9, and other odd pegs are marked in purple, and that indicates purl stitches. I'll be doing purl stitches on row 1 and on other odd rows. And where you see no elastics, that means I'm going to do knit stitches on row 1 and other odd rows. We'll do a chain cast on, and we'll start by tying a knot between peg 1 and peg 44. Now we're going to be starting on peg 44 and working counterclockwise, which is left to right. So we'll begin by placing a loop behind peg 44, and we'll bring that loop up to the front, and we'll pass the working yarn through that loop. This makes a new loop. We'll put the new loop behind peg 43. Feed the working yarn through that loop. Let's tighten it up. We'll put the loop behind peg 42. Feed the working yarn through that loop to make a new loop. Then put the loop behind the next peg. Feed the working yarn through to make a new loop. Put the loop behind the peg. Bring it forward. Feed the working yarn to make a new loop. So let's continue with our chain cast on all the way around the loom. So I've jumped ahead, I've worked my way around the loom, and now I'm casting on peg 3. We'll cast on peg 2. And for peg 1, we're just going to place that loop right on the peg, and then we'll tighten it up. On the front of the pegs, you'll see 1 strand of yarn. And on the back of the pegs, you'll see 2 strands of yarn. Okay, looks great. Now our chain cast on is done. So now let's start the seed stitch, which is a 2-row repeat. So on peg 1, we're going to do nothing. So that's a slip stitch on peg 1, which means we skip it entirely. Let's go to peg 2, where we're going to do a true knit stitch or a classic knit stitch. So place your yarn above the loop. With your hook, go in from the bottom under the loop to grab the working yarn. Pull it downwards to make a new loop. Take the old loop off the peg. Put the new loop on the peg. Now tighten it up, and next we're doing a purl stitch on peg 3. So lay the working yarn below, dive in with your hook to pull up the working yarn, make a new loop, take the old loop off the peg, put the new loop on the peg, then tighten it up. Now for a true knit stitch on peg 4, lay the working yarn above the loop, go in from the bottom under that loop to grab the working yarn and pull that working yarn downwards to make a new loop. Take the old loop off the peg, put the new loop on the peg. Let's tighten it up. Excellent. So on peg 5, let's do the purl stitch since it's marked in purple and this is an odd row like this row 1. That's because purple means purl on rows 1, 3, 5, 7, etc. For peg 6, we'll do a knit stitch. On peg 7, we're going to purl. So let's keep alternating these knit stitches and purl stitches on our own until we reach the other end of the loom, which is peg 44. So I fast forwarded to peg 42 where I do a knit stitch. On peg 43, I do a purl stitch. Since it's marked in purple and I'm working an odd row. On peg 44, I'm doing something different, so pay attention here. We're doing a U-wrap knit stitch, which is front to back. And be loose here, be looser than me. And then I'm going to knit over that bottom loop. Okay, and that's because we're going to work on making a smooth edge. Now row 1 is done. So let's start row 2. So on peg 44, we're doing something a bit different again, which means we just skip it since that's a slip stitch. Then on peg 43, we'll do a knit stitch. So now purple elastics mean that we knit. So for all even rows, the purple pegs mean knit, and the empty pegs, like peg 42, mean purl. So we knit on peg 41, which is marked with a purple elastic. So this knit stitch for my project is a true or classic knit stitch, but keep in mind that you can also use a U-knit or U-wrap knit stitch as well as an E-wrap knit stitch, depending on your preference. And now we purl on peg 40, which doesn't have any marker or elastic on it. So to summarize the seed stitch, you're going to knit on a peg that you purled before, and you will purl on a peg that you had knit before. Okay, so that's the seed stitch. So I'll let you continue, and you can work your way all the way around the loom. So I've jumped ahead and I'm finishing up row 2. So I'm on peg 3 and I'm going to do my knit stitch on peg 3. I'll do a purl stitch on peg 2. And then I do a U-wrap or a U-knit stitch on peg 1. And try to be a little bit loose here. And now row 2 is done. And that's the 2-row repeat of the seed stitch. Now, if it helps you out, I have a knitting chart that I'm going to display. And obviously I can't display columns for all 44 pegs. That's why I show what you would do on the first 4 pegs and the last 4 pegs. So now let's untie the knot that we had tied at the very beginning. And now we're going to start row 3. So row 3 is just like row 1, so that means we skip peg 1 since it's a slip stitch. And on peg 2, we do a knit stitch. On peg 3, we'll do a purl stitch since it's marked in purple elastic, and since this is an odd row. On peg 4, we do a knit stitch. So just keep doing this 2-row repeat on your own, and let's meet again when it's time to add a new ball of yarn. So it's time to add a new ball of yarn. There's lots of different ways to do this. I'll show you just one way, which is the magic knot, and it's made up of 2 small knots that are side by side. So on the bottom, you see the old yarn, and on the top, it's the new yarn. So we'll put the old yarn under the new. Then we'll take that old yarn and put it over the 2 strands. We'll put the old yarn up through that loop. Then we'll pull on the old yarn. Okay, excellent, we're halfway done. You put the new yarn over the old. You put this new yarn under the 2 strands. We'll put this new yarn down through the loop. And then we'll pull on that new yarn. And then we pull the 2 longer strands to make the 2 little knots go side by side. And then we cut the ends. And there's your magic knot. So there are lots of different magic knot videos on YouTube, but let me link to the Bella Coco video that I used. I thought it was the easiest one to follow. So as for your blanket, just keep knitting and adding new balls of yarn. I used 6 balls of yarn to get a height of about 37 inches, while the width was about 32 inches. Now you can use more or fewer balls of yarn, depending on what size of blanket that you're looking for. So let's knit on our own, and we'll meet again when it's time to bind off. So I'm at peg 44, and I'm close to the end of my 6th ball of yarn. And to make sure I have enough yarn to bind off, I've wrapped my loom 3.5 times, and that will ensure I don't run out of yarn before my bind off is complete. So we're going to bind off in pattern, which means that we'll knit where we would normally knit, and we will purl where we would normally purl. This is a bit more advanced than the basic bind off, but I like the look of it better. So let's call pegs 44 and 43, peg 1 and peg 2. We wrap peg 1 and knit over. We knit on peg 2 because we maintain the same type of knit stitch that we did for the body of the blanket. We move the loop on peg 2 to peg 1. Knit over on peg 1. Move that loop from peg 1 to peg 2. Okay, excellent. We have done a bind off on 1 peg. So now we have a new peg 1 and peg 2. So we are going to purl on peg 2 because normally that's what we would be doing even if this were a normal row. Move the loop from peg 2 to peg 1. Knit over on peg 1. Move the loop from peg 1 to peg 2. Great. So now we have a new peg 1 and a new peg 2. So we knit on peg 2. We move 2 to 1. We knit over on 1. We move 1 to 2. Let's start the sequence again. Let's purl on 2. Move 2 to 1. Knit over on 1 and move 1 to 2. So let's continue to bind off in pattern on our own. The writing on the left might be helpful for you. So let's work on our own, and we'll meet after we've worked our way all the way around the loom. So I'll see you in a few minutes. I've jumped ahead here and I'm finishing my bind off. So I'm working a purl stitch on peg 2. I'm going to move it to the left. I'll knit over. I move it to the right. And now for peg 1, I'm doing a U-knit stitch front to back. I move the loop to the left. I knit over. Now I'm going to cut off a long tail. I'm going to take the loop off of the loom. I put that tail inside the loop, and then I'm going to tighten it up. Okay, now our blanket is off the knitting loom. So you can stretch out your stitches so that your blanket is flatter. It'll look better that way. And you're also going to need to weave in your ends. You can use your fingers or a crochet hook to weave in your ends. I'll put my tail through the bottom edge here towards the right, and then I'll work a few stitches in the opposite direction, which is towards the left. You'll go to the other end of the blanket and weave in that tail as well. I'm going to go along the edge again in one direction and then work my way back, but I'll do that off camera. And now the seed stitch blanket is done. I really hope you liked this tutorial and that it was helpful for you. If you did enjoy it, please press like and leave me a comment.